Hoffman, the network architect who built the professional internet. March 28, 1967. Stanford University Hospital, Palo Alto, California. A child is born into a world on the brink of transformation. The summer of love is just months away. Silicon Valley doesn't exist yet, not really. The area is still orchards and electronics companies making components for the military. The integrated circuit is only 8 years old. The microprocessor won't be invented for another 4 years. The personal computer is still a science fiction fantasy. But this child, Reid Hoffman, will grow up to become one of the architects of the internet age. Not by inventing the technology, but by understanding something far more valuable. He will understand that the internet's true power lies not in connecting computers, but in connecting people. And he will build the infrastructure that allows professionals around the world to find each other, collaborate, and build their careers in ways that were impossible before. This is the story of how a boy who loved philosophy and role-playing games became the man who created LinkedIn, invested in Facebook before almost anyone else, and helped define what it means to be an entrepreneur in the 21st century. It's a story about seeing patterns others miss, about understanding human networks long before social networks existed, and about the power of relationships compounded over decades. But to understand how Reid Hoffman became Reid Hoffman, we need to start at the beginning. We need to understand the world he was born into, the family that shaped him, and the intellectual journey that would define everything that followed. The world that made Reid Hoffman. 1967 was a year of contradictions in America. The country was simultaneously reaching for the stars and tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War was escalating, with over 480,000 American troops deployed by year's end. The civil rights movement was entering a new, more militant phase after years of progress and backlash. In January, just 2 months before Reid's birth, the first Super Bowl was played. In June, the Six-Day War reshaped the Middle East. In October, Che Guevara was captured and executed in Bolivia. The Bay Area where Reid was born was becoming the epicenter of the counterculture movement. The Human Being had taken place in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park in January, featuring Timothy Leary, Allen Ginsberg, and Jerry Garcia. The Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane were creating the soundtrack of a generation. Berkeley was a hotbed of political activism and free speech movements. Young people were questioning everything about the established order, about authority, about the nature of society itself. But there was another revolution happening simultaneously, quieter but ultimately more transformative. The technological revolution was beginning in the same geographic area, though it would take years before anyone called it Silicon Valley. Fairchild Semiconductor, the company that spawned dozens of chip companies, was already established in the area. Hewlett-Packard, founded in a Palo Alto garage in 1939, was becoming a major force in electronics. The Stanford Research Institute was doing cutting-edge work that would eventually lead to ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet. The economy was strong. Gross domestic product growth was around 6%. Unemployment was under 4%. The stock market was in the middle of a long bull run that had started in the early 60s. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was around 900, having grown steadily throughout the decade. Housing prices in Palo Alto were rising as the area's reputation for technological innovation attracted talent and investment. This was the world Reid Hoffman entered. A world where the old order was being questioned, where young people believed they could change everything, where technology was beginning its march toward ubiquity, and where the San Francisco Bay Area was becoming the place where both cultural and technological revolutions were born. Family background, intellect and idealism. Reid's parents were intellectuals who embodied the best aspects of the 60s counterculture, the questioning spirit and idealism, without the drug-fueled chaos that often accompanied it. His father was a lawyer who valued rigorous thinking and clear argument. His mother was involved in education and deeply committed to progressive causes. Both were readers, thinkers, people who believed that ideas mattered and that thoughtful people could make the world better. The Hoffman household was one where dinner-table conversation ranged across politics, philosophy, literature, and current events. Books lined the walls. The New York Times arrived every morning. National Public Radio played in the background. This was not a family that watched much television or consumed passive entertainment. This was a family that engaged with ideas. Reid's mother, in particular, shaped his early intellectual development. She was a voracious reader who believed education was the key to everything. She encouraged Reid to read widely, to question assumptions, to think critically about the world around him. She was involved in progressive education movements and believed that learning should be about developing the ability to think, not just memorizing facts. His father brought a different kind of influence, the lawyer's ability to construct and deconstruct arguments, to see multiple sides of a question, to understand that truth is often more complex than it first appears. He taught Reid to think carefully about language, about how words shape understanding, about the difference between a strong argument and a weak one. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They lived in Berkeley, that hotbed of intellectual ferment and political activism. The city in the late 60s and 70s was still reeling from the free speech movement and the anti-war protests. Telegraph Avenue was lined with bookstores, cafes, and countercultural businesses. The university campus was a constant site of debate, protest, and intellectual exploration. This environment, a family that valued ideas and a city that was constantly questioning everything, shaped Reid profoundly. He grew up understanding that the world could be different than it was, that thoughtful people could envision alternatives and work to create them, that ideas had power and consequences. But there was also a practical dimension to his upbringing. His parents believed in changing the world, but they also understood that you needed to understand how the world actually worked before you could change it. Idealism needed to be grounded in reality. Vision needed to be coupled with execution. This combination of idealistic thinking and practical understanding would become one of Reid's defining characteristics. Reid was an only child for much of his early life, which meant he spent a lot of time with adults and their conversations. He learned to listen, to process complex ideas, to hold his own in discussions with people much older than himself. This early immersion in adult intellectual discourse gave him a kind of precocity, not in a show-off way, but in his ability to engage with sophisticated concepts from a young age. The family took education seriously but not oppressively so. They believed learning should be joyful, exploratory, driven by curiosity rather than external pressure. They encouraged Reid to follow his interests wherever they led. If he wanted to spend hours reading about medieval history or playing strategy games, that was valuable. If he wanted to learn about philosophy or economics, they would provide the books and the conversation to support that. This freedom to explore, combined with high expectations for thoughtfulness and rigor, created a powerful foundation. Reid learned that his interests mattered, that pursuing what fascinated him was not only acceptable but encouraged, and that the best kind of learning came from genuine curiosity rather than external requirements. Childhood, the boy who loved games and ideas. Reid Hoffman was not a typical child, if there is such a thing. While other kids were playing kickball or watching Saturday morning cartoons, Reid was often found with his nose in a book or hunched over a board game, analyzing strategies and probabilities. He was the kind of kid who thought deeply about everything, who asked why questions constantly, who wanted to understand not just what was true but why it was true. His earliest passion was games, particularly strategy games and role-playing games. Dungeons and Dragons became an obsession when he discovered it in the mid-70s, when he was around 8 or 9 years old. This wasn't just entertainment for Reid. It was a laboratory for understanding human behavior, social dynamics, strategy, and storytelling. In Dungeons and Dragons, you create a character and navigate a fantasy world created by the dungeon master. But the game is really about collaboration, about working with other players to solve problems, about negotiating resources and making decisions under uncertainty, about understanding how different people think and what motivates them. Reid played the game intensely, not just rolling dice and moving through dungeons, but thinking carefully about character development, narrative arcs, strategic choices, and group dynamics. He quickly became a dungeon master himself, creating elaborate worlds and campaigns for his friends. This required thinking about motivation, about what would make a story engaging, about how to balance challenge and reward, about how to create situations where players had meaningful choices. It was, in retrospect, early training in understanding what would later be called game theory and mechanism design, though he didn't have those words for it at the time. Beyond Dungeons and Dragons, Reid loved all kinds of strategy games. Chess, obviously, but also more complex games like Risk, Diplomacy, and later, when he discovered them, the sophisticated strategy games coming out of Europe. These games taught him to think several moves ahead, to anticipate what opponents would do, to understand incentives and constraints, to optimize under uncertainty. But games were not his only interest. Reid was a voracious reader from an early age. He loved science fiction and fantasy, particularly works by authors like Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Frank Herbert. These weren't just adventure stories for him. They were thought experiments about how societies could be organized differently, about how technology changes human possibilities, about the relationship between individuals and systems. He read history with the same intensity, particularly the history of ideas and the history of technological change. He wanted to understand not just what happened but why it happened, what conditions led to certain outcomes, what patterns repeated across different times and places. This historical consciousness, this sense that present circumstances are shaped by past events and that understanding those patterns can help you anticipate the future, would become central to his later thinking. Philosophy fascinated him even as a child. He encountered philosophers like Plato and Aristotle in his parents' bookshelves and tried to work through their ideas. The questions they asked, about the nature of reality, about how we know what we know, about what constitutes a good life, about how society should be organized, these questions gripped him. He didn't necessarily understand everything he read, but he understood that these were important questions and that thinking carefully about them mattered. Reid was also drawn to economics and business from an early age, though not in a stereotypically capitalist way. He was interested in how systems worked, how incentives shaped behavior, how resources got allocated, how markets functioned. He read books like Paul Samuelson's economics textbook not because he had to for school but because he wanted to understand how the economic world operated. Socially, Reid was well-liked but somewhat unusual. He had friends, but his friendships often formed around shared intellectual interests rather than just proximity or shared activities. He was the kid who would rather have a long conversation about ideas than play sports. He was thoughtful, earnest, genuinely curious about what people thought and why they thought it. Teachers generally loved him because he was engaged, asked good questions, did the work thoughtfully rather than just completing assignments mechanically. But some found him challenging because he wanted to understand the why behind everything, not just accept things because that's how they were. He wasn't rebellious in a disruptive way, but he was definitely not a passive recipient of information. One story from his childhood captures his nature well. In middle school, he became fascinated with game theory after reading about it in a popular science book. He started thinking about the prisoner's dilemma and other classic game theory problems. He created his own experiments with classmates, setting up situations to see how people would actually behave when faced with cooperation versus defection scenarios. His teachers didn't quite know what to make of this kid who was essentially running behavioral economics experiments during recess. This combination of intellectual curiosity, strategic thinking, love of games and systems, and genuine interest in understanding human behavior would define everything that came after. Reid wasn't trying to be an entrepreneur or a venture capitalist or a tech titan as a child. He was just following his interests. But those interests, and the habits of mind they created, turned out to be perfect preparation for the world he would eventually inhabit. Education, the intellectual formation. Reid Hoffman's formal education was a journey through some of the world's most prestigious institutions, but more importantly, it was a journey of intellectual formation that would shape everything he later built. His path took him from the Putney School, a progressive boarding school in Vermont, to Stanford University for his undergraduate degree, then to Oxford University for graduate work in philosophy, and finally back to Stanford for business school. Each stop added layers to his thinking and expanded his understanding of how the world worked. The Putney School, where Reid attended high school, was perfect for someone with his temperament and interests. Founded in 1935 by Carmelita Hinton, it was a progressive school that emphasized experimental learning, student autonomy, and intellectual exploration. Students worked on the school's farm, participated in governance, and were encouraged to pursue their passions with depth rather than breadth. At Putney, Reid found an environment that validated his approach to learning. He could dive deeply into subjects that fascinated him. He took advanced classes in philosophy, economics, and computer science. He continued to play and design elaborate role-playing games with friends. He read voraciously, working through dense texts in philosophy and political theory that most high school students wouldn't touch. But Putney also exposed him to something he hadn't fully experienced before, a community of similarly intellectually intense peers. These weren't just smart kids, they were kids who cared deeply about ideas, who would stay up late debating philosophy or politics or literature, who took their intellectual development seriously. Reid found his tribe. Computer science at Putney was still relatively new in the early 80s when Reid was there. Personal computers were just beginning to become available. The Apple II had been released in 1977. The IBM PC came out in 1981. Schools were just beginning to figure out how to incorporate computing into their curricula. Reid took to programming immediately. He loved the combination of logical thinking and creative problem-solving that programming required. He could see connections between the strategic thinking he'd developed through games, the logical rigor he'd learned from philosophy, and the systematic approach required to write code that actually worked. Programming wasn't just a technical skill for him. It was another way of thinking about how to solve problems and build systems. During his time at Putney, Reid also began to think more seriously about what he wanted to do with his life. The adults around him, teachers and mentors, could see that he had unusual intellectual gifts and drive. They encouraged him to think ambitiously about his future. But Reid wasn't drawn to traditional prestigious paths like law or medicine. He was drawn to ideas, to understanding systems, to figuring out how things worked and how they could work differently. When it came time to apply to colleges, Stanford was an obvious choice. By the mid-80s, Stanford was already establishing itself as the intellectual heart of Silicon Valley, though that term was still relatively new. The university had long encouraged entrepreneurship and collaboration between academia and industry. Faculty members like Frederick Terman had actively encouraged students and colleagues to start companies. Hewlett-Packard, started by Stanford graduates in a Palo Alto garage, was the model everyone pointed to. Reid arrived at Stanford in 1985, just as the personal computer revolution was beginning to take off. The Macintosh had been released the previous year. Microsoft had released Windows 1.0 that same year, though it wouldn't become dominant for several more years. The technology industry was growing rapidly, but the internet as we know it didn't exist yet. The World Wide Web wouldn't be invented until 1989 and wouldn't become publicly available until the early 90s. At Stanford, Reid majored in symbolic systems, an unusual interdisciplinary program that combined philosophy, cognitive science, linguistics, and computer science. This wasn't a traditional major like English or economics. It was a program designed for students who wanted to understand intelligence, both human and artificial, from multiple angles. Students studied logic, artificial intelligence, the philosophy of mind, cognitive psychology, and computational linguistics. The Symbolic Systems program was perfect for someone like Reid who refused to be confined to a single discipline. He could study Aristotle in the morning and artificial intelligence in the afternoon. He could think about epistemology and information theory as related enterprises. He could ask questions about the nature of knowledge and thinking from both philosophical and computational perspectives. His professors noticed his unusual combination of interests and abilities. He could write sophisticated philosophy papers that engaged seriously with difficult texts and complex arguments. He could also write elegant code and think clearly about algorithms and data structures. He could move fluidly between abstract theoretical thinking and concrete practical problem solving. During his undergraduate years, Reid continued to play and design role-playing games. But now he started thinking about them more analytically. He began to see games as systems with rules, incentives, and emergent properties. He thought about how game mechanics shaped player behavior, how narrative and gameplay interacted, how social dynamics emerged from formal structures. This wasn't just hobby thinking. It was the beginning of what would become a sophisticated understanding of how to design systems that shape human behavior in intended ways. Reid also became involved in Stanford's entrepreneurial culture. He attended talks by successful entrepreneurs, many of them Stanford alumni who had started companies in the Valley. He heard stories about risk-taking, about seeing opportunities others missed, about building something from nothing. The message was clear in Silicon Valley: smart people didn't just get good jobs working for established companies. Smart people created new things, took risks, built the future. But Reid wasn't ready to jump into entrepreneurship right after college. He had intellectual questions that weren't satisfied yet. He wanted to understand fundamental things about knowledge, truth, rationality, human nature. He wanted to engage more deeply with philosophy before diving into the practical world of technology and business. So after graduating from Stanford in 1989, Reid did something unusual for someone interested in technology and entrepreneurship. He went to Oxford University to pursue graduate studies in philosophy. This was not the obvious next step for someone who would later become one of Silicon Valley's most important figures. But it was exactly right for Reid. At Oxford, Reid studied as a Marshall Scholar, a prestigious scholarship program designed to strengthen the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. He focused on epistemology, the study of knowledge, and the philosophy of language. He worked with some of the world's leading philosophers, engaging with questions about how we know what we know, how language shapes thought, what rationality means. Oxford in the early 90s was still very much in the tradition of analytic philosophy that had dominated English-speaking philosophy for decades. The focus was on logical rigor, careful argument, precise use of language. Students were trained to think with extreme care about the structure of arguments, the meaning of terms, the logical relationships between premises and conclusions. Reid thrived in this environment. He loved the rigor, the demand for clarity, the insistence on precise thinking. He wrote papers on modal logic, on theories of reference, on the nature of knowledge and justification. He participated in the famous Oxford tutorial system, meeting weekly with tutors for intense one-on-one discussions about his work. But even as he engaged deeply with abstract philosophy, Reid never lost sight of practical questions about how the world actually worked. He was interested in epistemology not just as an abstract intellectual exercise but because understanding how knowledge works has practical implications for how to build systems, how to make decisions, how to navigate uncertainty. He began to see connections between philosophical questions and practical challenges. Questions about rational decision-making under uncertainty connected to economics and game theory. Questions about how language works connected to issues of communication and coordination. Questions about knowledge and justification connected to how individuals and organizations learn and adapt. During his time at Oxford, the Internet was beginning to emerge as a significant force. The World Wide Web had been invented at CERN in 1989 and was beginning to spread. Mosaic, the first widely used web browser, was released in 1993. Email was becoming common in academic institutions. People were beginning to realize that connecting computers globally might fundamentally change how information flowed and how people communicated. Reid paid attention to these developments. He could see that something significant was happening, that the Internet might be more than just a tool for academics and researchers, that it might fundamentally reshape how people interacted and organized themselves. His philosophical training gave him a framework for thinking about what this might mean. If information and communication were becoming radically cheaper and faster, what would that do to social structures, to markets, to political systems? After completing his master's degree at Oxford, Reid faced a choice. He could continue in academic philosophy, pursuing a doctorate and an academic career. He had the intellectual ability for it, and his professors encouraged him to continue. Or he could return to Silicon Valley and engage with the technological revolution that was clearly underway. The decision wasn't difficult. As much as Reid loved philosophy, he realized that the most important philosophical questions of his time were going to be worked out not in academic journals but in the practical work of building new technologies and new kinds of organizations. The questions about how people communicate, how information flows, how coordination happens, how communities form, these were about to become live questions in the real world as the Internet enabled new possibilities. So Reid returned to Silicon Valley, but not before making one more educational detour. He applied to Stanford's Graduate School of Business, was accepted, and enrolled in 1995. This might seem like yet another delay before actually doing something, but Reid understood that he needed to understand business, finance, strategy, and organizational behavior if he was going to build companies and shape the emerging internet economy. Stanford's business school in the mid-90s was the epicenter of thinking about technology entrepreneurship. The internet boom was just beginning. Netscape had gone public in August 1995 in a spectacular IPO that kicked off the dot-com era. Yahoo was growing rapidly. Amazon had just launched. The professors and students at Stanford Business School were thinking constantly about how to build and finance internet companies, what business models might work, how to scale organizations rapidly. Reid absorbed everything. He took classes in strategy, organizational behavior, finance, negotiation. He studied case studies of successful companies and failed startups. He learned about venture capital, how it worked, how VCs thought about risk and return, how they evaluated opportunities. He met classmates who would go on to become important figures in technology. He built relationships with professors who were thinking seriously about entrepreneurship and innovation. But more than specific content, business school gave Reid a framework for thinking about how to actually build things. Philosophy had taught him to think clearly and rigorously. His undergraduate work had given him technical skills and an understanding of systems. Business school taught him about execution, about taking ideas and turning them into organizations, about raising capital, about hiring people, about competition and positioning. By the time Reid graduated from Stanford Business School in 1997, he had assembled an unusual and powerful toolkit. He understood philosophy and could think rigorously about fundamental questions. He understood computer science and how to build technical systems. He understood cognitive science and how people think. He understood business strategy and organizational dynamics. And he understood the social and historical forces that were reshaping the world. More importantly, he had developed a clear vision. The internet was going to fundamentally change how people connected with each other, how information flowed, how economic activity was organized. Someone needed to build the infrastructure for this new world. Someone needed to create the platforms that would allow people to find each other, collaborate, build careers, and create value in ways that weren't possible before. Reid Hoffman was going to be one of those people. His education hadn't been a detour. It had been preparation. Now it was time to build. The secret sources of Reid Hoffman's success. Understanding what made Reid Hoffman exceptional requires looking beyond his accomplishments to the non-obvious advantages that enabled them. Many people are smart, many people work hard. Many people have good ideas. But very few create the kind of sustained value and influence that Reid has created over 3 decades. What were his secret sources? What allowed him to see opportunities others missed, to make connections others didn't see, to build things that changed how millions of people work and connect? The answer lies in 5 specific advantages that compounded over time. Network advantage, idea advantage, timing advantage, character advantage, and systematic advantage. Each of these was developed deliberately over years, each created leverage that enabled everything else. Together, they formed a mutually reinforcing system that made Reid one of the most successful entrepreneurs and investors of his generation. Let's examine each advantage in detail, showing not just what it was but how he developed it, how he used it, and why it mattered so much. Network advantage, relationships as compound interest. Reid Hoffman's most fundamental advantage was his understanding that relationships compound like interest. Most people think of networking as transactional. You meet people who might help you with something specific. Reid understood networking as building genuine relationships that create value for decades, relationships that grow more valuable over time as the people in your network become more capable, more connected, more influential themselves. This insight came early. At Stanford, Reid didn't just make friends with fellow students. He built genuine relationships based on shared intellectual interests and mutual respect. He helped people, introduced people to each other, created value for his network without immediate expectation of return. When he went to Oxford, he maintained those Stanford relationships. When he returned to business school, he added new relationships while keeping the old ones alive. The key was consistency and genuine care. Reid remembered details about people's lives, their interests, their goals. He followed up. He made introductions. He helped however he could, with advice, with connections, with support. He understood that the value of a relationship is not just what that person can do for you today, but what the relationship enables over decades. By the time Reid started thinking about entrepreneurship in the late 90s, he had a network that gave him extraordinary advantages. He could call people at companies across Silicon Valley and get honest information. He could assemble teams quickly because talented people wanted to work with him. He could raise money because investors trusted him. He could get introductions to anyone he needed to meet. But the network advantage went deeper than just having connections. Reid understood network effects before most people, how the value of a network increases exponentially as it grows, how platforms that connect people can become more valuable than products, how being at the center of a valuable network creates compound advantages. This understanding came from his academic background in cognitive science and philosophy combined with his experience building relationships. He saw that networks of people operated according to similar principles as neural networks or social systems studied by sociologists. There were hubs and nodes, weak ties and strong ties, clustering and centrality. Understanding these dynamics gave him insight into how to build networks, both personal and digital, that would scale and create value. When Reid later built LinkedIn, this wasn't just a random product idea. It was the culmination of 2 decades of thinking about networks, experiencing the power of networks in his own life, and understanding the theoretical principles that govern how networks function and grow. He was building the tool he wished had existed earlier, a way to make professional networks visible, accessible, and actionable for everyone, not just for people like him who had spent years cultivating relationships. The network advantage also manifested in how Reid built companies. He understood that hiring wasn't just about finding qualified individuals. It was about building a network of people who would work well together, who brought complementary skills and perspectives, who would strengthen each other through collaboration. The whole could be much greater than the sum of the parts if you assembled the right network of people. This advantage compounded over time. As Reid's company succeeded, as his investments paid off, as his reputation grew, more talented people wanted to be in his network. Being connected to Reid meant being connected to many other valuable people and opportunities. The network became self-reinforcing, attracting exactly the kind of people who would make it more valuable. By the time Reid became a prominent venture capitalist at Greylock Partners, his network advantage was overwhelming. He could evaluate deals better because he could call founders who had worked in the space and get honest assessments. He could add value to portfolio companies by opening doors that would be closed to others. He could recruit talent for companies because people trusted his judgment about which opportunities were worth pursuing. The network advantage also gave Reid pattern recognition capabilities that others lacked. Because he knew so many people across different industries and stages of career development, he could see trends emerging before they became obvious. He could identify talented people early in their careers, before their potential was widely recognized. He could spot opportunities at the intersection of different domains because his network spanned multiple worlds. Most importantly, Reid understood that maintaining a network requires genuine generosity. You can't just take. You have to give, consistently and without immediate expectation of return. Reid was famous for making introductions, for giving advice, for helping portfolio companies and friends navigate challenges. This generosity wasn't calculated, though it certainly had strategic benefits. It was rooted in his genuine belief that helping others succeed made the entire ecosystem stronger. The network advantage Reid built over 3 decades is now nearly impossible for anyone to replicate from scratch. It's the result of 30 years of consistent relationship building, of being genuinely helpful, of being at the center of important developments in technology and entrepreneurship. It's a moat that gets wider every year, because every person who succeeds after Reid helped them becomes another node in his network, another source of information and influence. Idea advantage, multidisciplinary pattern recognition. Reid Hoffman's second critical advantage was his ability to synthesize ideas from multiple disciplines and see patterns that specialists missed. This came directly from his unusual educational path, from philosophy to cognitive science to computer science to business. While most entrepreneurs specialized early, Reid spent a decade building a multidisciplinary toolkit that allowed him to think about problems from angles others couldn't access. The philosophy training was particularly important. Philosophy teaches you to think about first principles, to question assumptions that everyone else takes for granted, to see the deep structure underlying surface phenomena. When Reid looked at the emerging internet in the mid-90s, he didn't just see a new technology. He saw fundamental questions about identity, about knowledge, about coordination, about how humans organize themselves socially and economically. His work in epistemology, the study of knowledge, gave him frameworks for thinking about how information flows through networks, how people learn from each other, how collective intelligence emerges from individual contributions. These weren't just abstract philosophical questions. They were deeply practical questions about how to design systems that would help people share knowledge and learn from each other effectively. The cognitive science background gave Reid insight into how people actually think and make decisions, as opposed to how economists or engineers assume they think. He understood that humans are not perfectly rational calculating machines. They use heuristics and shortcuts. They're influenced by context and framing. They make decisions based on emotion and intuition as much as analysis. Designing systems that work for real humans requires understanding these cognitive realities. His computer science knowledge meant he understood what was technically possible and what constraints existed. He could talk to engineers about architecture and scalability. He could evaluate whether a technical approach would actually work at scale. He wasn't an engineer himself by this point, but he spoke the language and understood the trade-offs involved in different technical choices. The business education gave him frameworks for thinking about value creation, competitive dynamics, organizational design, and financial sustainability. He understood that even the most brilliant technology is useless if it can't be turned into a sustainable business. He could think about business models, about customer acquisition economics, about network effects and defensibility. But the real advantage came from combining these different ways of thinking. Reid could look at a market opportunity and simultaneously think about the philosophical question of what problem are we really solving, the cognitive question of how will people actually behave, the technical question of what's possible to build, and the business question of how to capture value. This multidimensional thinking allowed him to see opportunities and risks that people focused on just one dimension would miss. A perfect example of this advantage was LinkedIn itself. Most people in the early 2000s thought about social networking as entertainment, as a way to keep up with friends and share photos and updates. Friendster launched in 2002, MySpace in 2003. They were focused on personal social connections and content sharing. Reid saw something different. He understood from philosophy that identity is contextual, people present themselves differently in different social contexts. He understood from cognitive science that people think about their professional identity differently than their personal identity, with different goals, different audiences, different norms. He understood from his own experience the power of professional networks and weak ties, acquaintances, and former colleagues who might have valuable information or opportunities. He also understood from game theory and economics that professionals had different incentives than personal social networkers. People are motivated to maintain accurate professional profiles because they want to be found for job opportunities. They're motivated to connect with colleagues because professional networks have clear economic value. The incentive structure for a professional network was fundamentally different and more sustainable than for a personal social network. This multidisciplinary thinking allowed Reid to see that a professional social network could solve the cold start problem that plagued most networks. People would create profiles because it helped them professionally. They would connect to colleagues because those connections had value. The network would bootstrap itself through professional incentives rather than requiring critical mass of friends for entertainment value. Reid's idea advantage also manifested in how he thought about strategy. He was famous for articulating concepts that others felt intuitively but couldn't express clearly. The concept of blitzscaling, growing at breakneck speed to achieve winner-take-all dominance in a market, was something many companies had done implicitly. Reid gave it a name, articulated the conditions under which it makes sense, explained the risks and trade-offs, and created a framework others could use. Similarly, his concept of ABZ planning, always have a plan A, plan B, and a plan Z, came from thinking philosophically about decision-making under uncertainty while understanding practically how careers and startups actually unfold. Plan A is what you're doing now. Plan B is what you'll pivot to if Plan A doesn't work. Plan Z is your fallback if everything goes wrong. This framework sounds simple, but it captures important truths about how to navigate uncertainty that most people handle only implicitly. The ability to name and frame concepts is extremely valuable. It allows vague intuitions to become communicable ideas. It creates common language for discussing strategy. It enables coordination because everyone understands what you mean. Reid's philosophical training in precise use of language combined with his practical experience building companies gave him an unusual ability to create these frameworks. Another dimension of Reid's idea advantage was his historical consciousness. He read widely in history, particularly the history of technology and business. He understood that many supposedly new developments had precedents and patterns. The internet might be new, but the dynamics of network effects had played out before in railroads and telephones. The platform business model might be enabled by new technology, but the strategic principles had analogs in earlier eras. This historical perspective saved Reid from many of the mistakes that founders without that context made. When everyone in the dot-com boom was convinced that profitability didn't matter because the internet changed everything, Reid knew from history that fundamentals always matter eventually. When everyone was focused on viral growth at any cost, Reid understood that sustainable growth required solid unit economics and a real value proposition. Reid also had an unusual ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. He could think like a founder, like an investor, like a user, like a competitor, all at the same time. This came from his philosophical training in considering multiple viewpoints and from his experience playing and designing role-playing games, where you had to think from the perspective of different characters with different goals and information. This multi-perspectival thinking made Reid an extraordinarily valuable advisor and board member. He could help founders see their business from angles they were missing. He could anticipate how competitors would respond. He could understand what would motivate users or customers. He could think about what investors would care about. He could integrate all these perspectives into coherent strategic advice. The idea advantage also made Reid an exceptional networker in a different sense. He connected ideas from different domains in ways that created new insights. He introduced people not just because they might do business together but because their ideas would spark interesting combinations. He saw himself as a node that facilitated intellectual cross-pollination, not just business transactions. Many of Reid's most successful investments came from this multidisciplinary thinking. When he invested in Facebook early, before almost any professional investor, it wasn't because he had insider information or special access. It was because he understood network effects, he understood social dynamics, he understood identity and self-presentation, and he could see that Facebook was building something fundamentally more powerful than predecessors like Friendster or MySpace. When he invested in Airbnb early, despite significant skepticism from other investors about whether people would really rent rooms to strangers, Reid understood the combination of economic incentives, reputation systems, and social trust that could make it work. He could see patterns from eBay's feedback system, from Craigslist's community self-policing, from economic research on trust and reciprocity. He synthesized insights from multiple domains to reach a conclusion that seemed counterintuitive to others. The idea advantage compounded over time because each new experience added to Reid's mental models. Each company he built or invested in taught him something new. Each failure revealed blind spots or incorrect assumptions. Each success confirmed or refined his frameworks. Over 30 years, he built an extraordinarily sophisticated and nuanced understanding of how technology companies work, when they succeed, why they fail. By his late 40s and 50s, Reid's idea advantage had become almost impossible for younger entrepreneurs and investors to match. He had seen multiple cycles, multiple technology waves, thousands of companies at different stages. He had pattern matched across 3 decades of experience. He could say with confidence, "I've seen this pattern before, here's what happened, here's what to watch out for." That kind of wisdom can't be downloaded or learned from books. It comes only from decades of thoughtful experience. Timing advantage, being early to permanent shifts. Reid Hoffman's third critical advantage was his exceptional timing. He entered the technology industry at exactly the right moment, graduated business school in 1997 just as the internet boom was accelerating, started LinkedIn in 2002 when social networking was becoming viable but before the market was crowded, and moved into venture capital when his operating experience and network were most valuable. But calling this luck misses the deeper truth. Reid's timing advantage came from his ability to distinguish between temporary trends and permanent shifts, to see which way the wind was blowing before it became obvious to everyone else, and to position himself to take advantage of large-scale changes rather than short-term opportunities. This ability came partly from his historical knowledge. Reid understood that truly transformative technologies go through predictable phases. There's an early experimental phase when only enthusiasts pay attention. Then there's a rapid growth phase when the technology becomes accessible to mainstream users. Then there's a shakeout when the market consolidates around a few winners. Finally, there's a mature phase where the technology becomes infrastructure that everyone takes for granted. Understanding these phases helped Reid time his moves. He didn't try to build consumer internet companies in the early 90s when the web was still too primitive and internet penetration too low. He waited until the infrastructure was in place, until enough people had internet access, until browsers were good enough, until the conditions were right for consumer applications to scale. Similarly, he understood that social networking required critical mass of users with always-on internet connections and comfort with online interaction. The conditions weren't right in the late 90s. They became right in the early 2000s as broadband penetrated homes, as people became comfortable with email and instant messaging, as the infrastructure matured. Reid timed LinkedIn's launch to coincide with these enabling conditions falling into place. The timing advantage also came from Reid's network, which gave him early signals about what was working. He could see what kinds of companies were getting traction, what kinds of business models were succeeding, what kinds of problems people were trying to solve. This gave him advance warning of trends before they became obvious in the data or the press. But perhaps most importantly, Reid distinguished between fads and fundamental shifts. The dot-com boom of the late 90s was full of companies chasing eyeballs and traffic without clear business models, assuming that attention could be monetized later. Reid understood that this was unsustainable, that real businesses needed to create real value for customers and capture some of that value as revenue. When the bubble burst in 2000 and 2001, many people concluded that the internet revolution had been overhyped, that the skeptics had been right all along. Reid understood differently. The fundamental shift was real. People were moving online. Communication and commerce were being transformed. But the specific business models and valuations of the bubble had been wrong. The opportunity was still there for companies that focused on creating real value rather than chasing hype. This understanding led to one of Reid's best-timed decisions, starting LinkedIn in December 2002, right in the depths of the post-bubble crash. Venture capital funding had dried up. Enthusiasm for internet companies was at an all-time low. Many entrepreneurs had left the valley or gone to work for established companies. It seemed like the worst possible time to start a new internet company. But Reid saw it differently. Precisely because funding was scarce and enthusiasm was low, there was less competition. Talented people were available. Costs were low because no one else was bidding up rents and salaries. The fundamental enabling technologies, broadband, web standards, browser capabilities, were maturing. The market was ready even though sentiment was terrible. Most importantly, Reid understood that the best time to start a company is not when everyone agrees it's a good idea. The best time is when you see something that will be obvious to everyone in 5 years but isn't obvious yet. If you wait until consensus forms, the opportunity is already competed away. The excess returns come from being right when others don't see it yet. This contrarian timing sense came from Reid's philosophical training in thinking carefully about how we know what we know. He understood that consensus is often wrong, especially at inflection points. He understood that crowds follow momentum and extrapolate recent trends. He had the intellectual confidence to trust his own analysis even when it diverged from consensus. The timing advantage showed up in Reid's investments as well. His investment in Facebook in 2004, at a $4.9 million valuation, came at a perfect moment. The company was past the proof of concept stage, but before it became obvious to everyone that social networking would be huge. He saw the network effects kicking in, the user engagement metrics that presaged massive growth, the quality of the team. He moved decisively when the opportunity was still available. Similarly, his early investments in companies like Airbnb and Dropbox came when these companies were unproven but showed signs that Reid's frameworks helped him recognize. He didn't wait for proof. He saw the potential in the early data and the quality of the founders and moved before the opportunities were bid up by consensus. But Reid's timing wasn't just about being early. It was also about patience and knowing when not to move. He didn't chase every hot trend. He didn't invest in companies just because they were getting buzz. He waited for opportunities that matched his frameworks, that fit his understanding of sustainable value creation, that addressed real problems in ways that could scale. This patience came from financial security and from philosophical temperament. Reid wasn't desperate. He could afford to wait for the right opportunities. He also understood from philosophy that not knowing is often the right answer, that uncertainty is real and shouldn't be papered over with false confidence. He was comfortable saying "I don't know" or "this isn't for me" even when others were excited. The timing advantage compounded over Reid's career. Each well-timed move, starting SocialNet early enough to learn but not expecting it to be the winner, joining PayPal at exactly the right moment, starting LinkedIn in the post-bubble trough, moving to venture capital after establishing operating credibility, positioned him perfectly for the next move. His career wasn't a random walk. It was a carefully sequenced series of positions that built on each other. By the time Reid was in his 40s and 50s, his timing sense was almost mystical to observers. He seemed to know where the market was going before anyone else. But it wasn't magic. It was decades of studying history, of building mental models of how technology adoption works, of maintaining a network that gave him early signals, of thinking philosophically about uncertainty and knowledge. The timing advantage looked like luck from outside but was actually the result of systematic thinking and careful positioning. Character advantage, intellectual honesty and long-term orientation. Reid Hoffman's fourth advantage was character, specifically intellectual honesty and genuine long-term orientation. In an industry full of hype, inflated claims, and short-term thinking, Reid stood out for his commitment to truth and his willingness to play long-term games. The intellectual honesty came from his philosophical training. Philosophy at its best is about following arguments wherever they lead, about admitting when you're wrong, about updating beliefs in response to evidence. Reid internalized this deeply. He was willing to change his mind, to admit mistakes, to acknowledge uncertainty. This sounds simple but is actually rare and extremely valuable. Most people, especially successful people, develop ego investments in their views. Admitting error feels like weakness. Changing direction seems like failure. Acknowledging that you don't know something threatens your status as an expert. These psychological barriers lead to doubling down on mistakes, to escalating commitment to failing strategies, to surrounding yourself with yes people who confirm your views. Reid avoided these traps through conscious intellectual practice. He actively sought out people who disagreed with him. He asked questions designed to uncover his own blind spots. He treated his beliefs as hypotheses to be tested rather than truths to be defended. When evidence came in that contradicted his expectations, he updated his views rather than explaining away the evidence. This intellectual honesty made Reid an exceptionally valuable board member and advisor. Founders knew they would get straight talk from him, not sugarcoating or false encouragement. If their strategy wasn't working, Reid would say so clearly. If he didn't know something, he would admit it rather than bluffing. This created trust. People knew that when Reid said something positive, he genuinely meant it. His praise was valuable precisely because it was honest. The intellectual honesty also made Reid a better decision-maker. He saw reality more clearly because he wasn't filtering it through defensive mechanisms. He could acknowledge problems earlier, pivot faster, cut losses when needed. He didn't cling to investments or strategies for ego reasons. If something wasn't working, he faced that fact and adjusted. But intellectual honesty alone isn't enough. It needs to be paired with genuine long-term orientation. Reid understood that the biggest payoffs come from playing long-term games, from making decisions that compound over decades rather than optimizing for quarterly results. This long-term orientation showed up in how Reid built relationships. He helped people without immediate expectation of return. He made introductions that didn't benefit him directly. He gave advice to founders who might never be able to pay him back. This wasn't calculated altruism. It came from genuine belief that building a strong ecosystem benefits everyone in it over the long run, including him. The long-term thinking also manifested in how Reid built companies. LinkedIn could have optimized for near-term revenue in many ways that would have undermined long-term value. They could have spammed users with emails. They could have sold user data aggressively. They could have cluttered the interface with ads. Reid understood that preserving user trust and providing genuine value was more important than maximizing near-term metrics. This required conviction and patience. Investors and board members often push for faster growth, higher revenue, more aggressive monetization. Reid had to explain repeatedly why certain short-term optimizations would destroy long-term value. His philosophical training helped him articulate these trade-offs clearly. His own experience and financial security gave him the credibility and freedom to stick to his principles. The character advantage created a virtuous cycle. Because Reid was intellectually honest, people trusted him. Because he played long-term games, his relationships compounded in value. Because he genuinely cared about creating value rather than just extracting it, talented people wanted to work with him. The character advantage became a multiplier on every other advantage. This showed up clearly in Reid's approach to venture capital. Unlike some VCs who see themselves as masters of the universe judging founders, Reid approached founders as partners. He acknowledged that they knew their businesses better than he did. He positioned himself as helpful rather than controlling. He used his advantages, network, experience, frameworks to add value rather than to extract concessions. This approach attracted the best founders. They wanted Reid on their cap table and their board not just for his money or his brand, but because he genuinely made their companies better. He opened doors. He provided strategic guidance. He helped them avoid mistakes he had seen others make. He connected them with talent and with other helpful people in his network. The character advantage also made Reid resilient through failures. When SocialNet didn't succeed, when investments failed, when strategies didn't work, Reid didn't become defensive or bitter. He analyzed what went wrong honestly, extracted lessons, and moved forward. This psychological resilience, rooted in intellectual honesty about both successes and failures, allowed him to take appropriate risks and recover quickly from setbacks. Reid's commitment to intellectual honesty and long-term thinking became more valuable as he became more successful. Success often corrupts. It creates hubris. It attracts sycophants. It makes people defensive about their track record. Reid consciously fought against these tendencies. He surrounded himself with people who would challenge him. He continued to learn and grow rather than assuming he had all the answers. He stayed grounded despite enormous success. By his 50s, Reid's character advantage had compounded into a reputation that opened every door. People knew that Reid Hoffman was someone who could be trusted, who played fair, who kept his word, who genuinely tried to help, who acknowledged mistakes, who thought long-term. This reputation was worth more than money. It was a form of capital that enabled everything else. Systematic advantage, frameworks and processes. Reid Hoffman's fifth and final advantage was his systematic approach to entrepreneurship and investing. While many successful people rely primarily on intuition or pattern recognition that they can't fully articulate, Reid built explicit frameworks and processes that he could teach, share, and systematically apply. This came from his academic training in building models and theories, from his philosophical work on epistemology and rationality, and from his experience designing role-playing games where explicit rules created emergent gameplay. Reid understood that systems and processes, while less glamorous than individual genius, are often more powerful and more scalable. The framework approach showed up in how Reid thought about strategy. He didn't just make decisions based on gut feel. He had explicit frameworks for evaluating opportunities, for thinking about competition, for assessing risk, for deciding when to scale. These weren't rigid checklists but flexible mental models that could be adapted to specific situations. One of Reid's most famous frameworks is the concept of Blitzscaling, the strategy of prioritizing speed over efficiency in the face of uncertainty. The framework specifies when this approach makes sense, when you have a large potential market, when winner-take-all or winner-take-most dynamics apply, when you have the ability to raise substantial capital, when speed to scale creates defensibility. It also specifies the risks and costs, the inevitable inefficiencies, the organizational challenges, the potential for catastrophic failure. By making this framework explicit, Reid enabled others to evaluate whether blitzscaling was right for their situation. The framework distilled decades of observation and experience into a teachable model. This is characteristic of Reid's systematic approach, taking tacit knowledge and making it explicit and transmissible. Another example is Reid's ABZ planning framework mentioned earlier. Plan A is your current strategy. Plan B is the alternative you'll pivot to if Plan A doesn't work. Plan Z is your lifeboat, what you'll do if everything fails. This simple framework helps people think more clearly about optionality, risk management, and adaptive planning. It's memorable, actionable, and generally applicable. Reid developed dozens of these frameworks over his career, for different aspects of building companies and evaluating investments. He had frameworks for assessing product-market fit, for thinking about network effects, for evaluating founding teams, for deciding when to pivot, for managing boards. Each framework captured important truths while remaining simple enough to communicate and use. The systematic advantage also showed in how Reid approached his own learning and decision-making. He didn't just accumulate experiences randomly. He actively extracted lessons, tested hypotheses, built models, refined his understanding. He treated his own knowledge development as an iterative process of theory building and testing. This showed up in how he conducted reference calls and due diligence. Reid didn't just ask random questions. He had a systematic process for evaluating founders and companies. He asked specific questions designed to uncover information that predicted success or failure. He compared responses across multiple references to triangulate truth. He looked for specific signals that his experience had taught him were predictive. The frameworks weren't just for his own use. Reid was exceptionally generous in sharing them. He wrote books, gave talks, published essays, taught courses, all aimed at making his frameworks and insights available to other entrepreneurs and investors. This generosity served multiple purposes. It helped the ecosystem overall. It established Reid as a thought leader. It attracted talented people who resonated with his ideas. And it created a common language that made collaboration easier. Reid's systematic approach extended to his network building. Many people network opportunistically, meeting people when they need something or when opportunities arise. Reid was more deliberate. He thought about what kinds of relationships would be valuable, who the key nodes were in different domains, how to maintain relationships over time. He had systems for staying in touch, for making valuable introductions, for adding value to his network. This didn't make the relationships artificial or transactional. Reid genuinely cared about people and was authentically interested in their success. But he combined genuine care with systematic thinking about how to build and maintain a valuable network over decades. The system amplified the authentic relationships rather than replacing them. The systematic advantage was particularly powerful in Reid's venture capital work. Many VCs rely heavily on gut feel and personal chemistry in making investment decisions. Reid combined intuition with systematic analysis. He had frameworks for evaluating market size, competitive dynamics, network effects, scalability, team quality, product market fit. He could articulate why he was making an investment decision in ways that others could evaluate and potentially learn from. This systematic approach made Reid a better partner to founders because he could provide specific, actionable advice grounded in frameworks they could understand and apply. Instead of just saying do this, he could explain the framework behind the recommendation, helping founders develop their own judgment rather than becoming dependent on him. The frameworks also made Reid's thinking debuggable. If a framework predicted one outcome and reality delivered another, Reid could examine the framework, figure out what was wrong, and refine it. This created a learning system that improved over time. Each experience, whether success or failure, fed back into the frameworks, making them more nuanced and accurate. By combining all 5 advantages, network, ideas, timing, character, and systems, Reid created a compound advantage that was nearly impossible to replicate. Each advantage reinforced the others. The network gave him better information for his frameworks. The frameworks helped him make better use of his network. His intellectual honesty made his network more valuable because people trusted him. His timing sense came from combining network information with systematic thinking. His character attracted the right people to his network. This wasn't luck. It was the result of 30 years of deliberate development across multiple dimensions. Reid didn't just stumble into success. He systematically built the capabilities and advantages that enabled success, drawing on his unique background in philosophy, cognitive science, and business, on his intellectual honesty and long-term orientation, and on his systematic approach to learning and execution. Understanding these secret sources is crucial for understanding not just Reid's individual success but his broader impact on Silicon Valley and the technology industry. Reid didn't just build companies and make investments. He helped create the playbook that other entrepreneurs and investors now use. He made tacit knowledge explicit. He turned individual experience into teachable frameworks. He built infrastructure, both technological and social, that others could use to build their own success. This is why Reid Hoffman matters beyond his personal achievements. He elevated the entire ecosystem through his systematic approach to understanding and teaching what makes entrepreneurship and investing successful. His true legacy may not be LinkedIn or his investment returns but the frameworks, networks, and ways of thinking that he contributed to the broader technology community.